Welcome to the Humanity in the Loop podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My guest today is Maggie Greyson. Maggie is Chief Futurist and CEO of Futures Present, a foresight consulting company. Making predictions is hard, especially about the future. Even so, Maggie helps people think long-term and decide what they really want. Today, we are going to discuss futurism and its impact on the choices we make in the present. Maggie, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tim. This is so exciting to be here. Thank you.
It's my delight. Thank you. If you can hear the ice cream truck outside, we'll just have that part of the ambiance. Alvin Toffler was called the world's most famous futurist. I believe he passed in 2016. My apologies to the futurist community. However, that mantle is up for grabs, so you could be next. Who knows what the future holds? His book, published in 1970, titled Future Shock, described the, I'm quoting here, shattering stress and disorientation that is caused by too much change in too short a period of time. When you consider the pace of change today versus the pace of change 50 years ago, isn't that sort of adorable that they were like, oh my God, things are changing so fast?
It's funny that you'd call it adorable. I too think that thinking about the future and how other people portray it is pretty cool and cute, and I get a kick out of what other people's interpretations were in the past. I think that he was really bang on in helping us to notice that change is palpable. And the rate of change is definitely unfathomable right now. And we say that if you're going to think about the future, it's ridiculous, then you're probably onto something. So if he was thinking about the future as going this speed, then he may have anticipated that we might be close to where we are now.
Right.
And that's a really interesting question because there is a Toffler's Associates organization. So that's a great question for them, actually.
Fair enough. I am wondering about that because I had a conversation a few years ago before COVID, and I was talking to somebody who's very knowledgeable and very intelligent, but we weren't quite seeing eye to eye on this question of whether things were changing faster all the time. And he was taking the viewpoint that tomorrow looks like today. Like I wouldn't worry too much about it. And I guess it's impossible to say because you need to be empirical about it. You need to sort of define what change means. But it does certainly feels to me like it's changing much faster than it ever has.
You're right again about change being empirical. We and also your friend is right too in terms of don't worry about it. Couple of different things there. One, some things change at such a glacial pace that we can't notice them. However, we can look for evidence that change has happened in those particular things. But it's when your friend says, don't worry about it, there's, I think one of the things that Alvin Toffler sort of stirs up is that we should be worried that change is occurring and that we're not noticing it.
Right.
I guess my perspective is that if we spend too much time worrying about the change, we're frozen and unable to take action. So if we kind of get to this basic viewpoint or foundational understanding, change is happening. It's not all changing at the rate that we expect it to. In some cases, it changes faster. In some cases, it changes slower. And that's one of the reasons why prediction is actually a very in my opinion, not excellent way of putting your money down. Um, it's because of that inability for humans to take everything into account that would speed up or slow down the change that we're anticipating.
Right. I agree with that completely. And I can, as evidence, I submit my terrible record at investing. You might see, it's like if you don't have concrete understanding of something, you might say, oh, that gust of wind is going to blow the car off the road, without knowing all the forces involved and all the inertia and all the, traction, everything. You can overestimate certain influences and make predictions that are wrong. Which brings us to being a futurist. So, and the challenges of being a futurist. So what do futurists do, and what in particular do you do?
Thanks for asking that question. You're not the first person to ask. My goal has been to help my mom understand what I do.
Excellent.
And so far, I think she's pretty close. So that means part of my job is done. And what futurists tend to do is help people to think about the future. That's sort of a baseline commonality with all of the work that we do. There are some futurists who help people to think about the future that they want. And there are some futurists that help people to think about the future that they need to be concerned about. And some of those are major, massive, life-changing, planetary-changing events that are too complex to, I guess, to really get in front of and make the kind of lever change that we need to, because we're sort of spinning out of control in a few different examples, climate change and some human rights issues and things like that. However, what I tend to do is help individuals to think about the future that they want. And there's a little spectrum in there between what someone else wants the future to be and what somebody thinks we should know about the future. And the little spectrum that I sort of play in is depending on who is asking the question. If an organization is asking the question because they want to get into a position of longevity. For example, I worked with the Ottawa Food Bank, and the question that they were thinking about is, how might we stop food insecurity in 2050 in Ottawa? And that is a major question that created a paradigm shift for how they provide the services that they do. And on the one hand, the provision of trying to solve food insecurity is something that they will always do. How they go about it is what's changing. And the thing that I was helping them to think about was, what are the forces that are going to continue to create food insecurity? And it's not just cost of housing. It's not just things that are economic and sort of can be adjusted with policies. It's things that include climate refugees. It's things that include potential climate blights, or things that include like what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now with fertilizer availability. So these are external factors that are going to affect food insecurity for everybody, and it will show up differently in the Ottawa region. And so if they're starting to look ahead at these intractable problems, they can start to make choices about what food security looks like. And it may be very different than what we think of nutrition on the plate and so on. In their situation, it may be providing food that is familiar to people's home, the spices that they're used to, and so on. So that's one example. And they're going for longevity with a mission. And so we help them think about the organization overcoming a global challenge, or overcoming a challenge that is outside of their control, or at least being able to think about how they want to contribute to that. In other cases, it's much more, the conversation is much more local. So working with individuals, I help them to imagine themselves in the future, and in multiple futures. And what are the possibilities that the future might be like? And, we can't predict. There's lots of potentialities. But in that kind of an instance, how do you want to contribute in the future tends to come back to values and things about how they want to be, access to fresh food, and conversations with friends and family, and quite often giving back as a mentor or a coach or something. So those are two sort of ends of the spectrum of the work that I do, if I could say it that way.
Yeah, that's terrific. So one of the things as I researched Maggie Greyson, I discovered is that you have a background in theater and design. How has that connected to your work as a futurist?
I wish when I was doing theater, I could imagine how my work would connect into the future. I did theater design for 10 years, and in the same summer, I worked on the oldest production of Twelfth Night, a 400th anniversary recreation in the exact location where the original performance was put on. The clothes were made by hand. The Middle Temple Hall in London, England was lit by candles. The goal was applied research. And then, again, in the same summer, I worked on one of the most innovative productions of Midsummer Night's Dream. And what was a parallel in both of these productions was the intense amount of research in terms of how are people doing things? What are other ways that are different than today? How can we capture an essence of that and build a narrative that has enough of if you think of a container, there's enough of a container for the narrative for people to get into it, but not necessarily because of the virtue of being performance, still live performance, still having a little bit of flexibility within that container for people to enter into the story or kind of sit back. And so the invitation of being a designer in this depends on the sort of the crew that I'm working with and the director and the actors. Do they perform in a way that breaks the fourth wall? Or do they create a completely contained production that this is the story that we want you to read or hear or understand in this way, and like a theme park, you're kind of come along with us for the ride.
Okay, that's awesome. So there's a couple of things in there. When you say the breaking the fourth wall, I'm sure people listening are familiar with that. It's like the idea that if you watch TV, there's like a wall in the back, two walls on the side, but you're the fourth wall. Is that sort of the idea? And that if somebody breaks that, they're engaging with the audience directly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or is it just context dependent?
It's context dependent. So if you're watching a TV show, and that's a little bit harder. You can break the fourth wall, just sort of breaking character, and instead of being within the world of the story that they're in, turning and acknowledging the audience. You're here. You might be thinking this right now, or I want you to know that. And it's a narrative device. It's also an invitation and an acknowledgement that this is a shared story.
Right. And I was wondering if that was where you were going, because it seems to me that, and I'm projecting, but a characteristic in common between futurism and theater design is you're trying to create a plausible world, right? A world that somebody can feel is real before them. But then also you're breaking the fourth wall to invite them to participate in the future a little bit.
Yeah, and that's very much my flavor of Futurist work. There's an emerging practice that is much more participatory, much more community-based. The research is deeper in terms of asking people to, through interviews, what is it that you see in the future, and how might that create a shared image? And once we have a community image of what the future might be, then that people can connect with it more, and then create action with it more. Right. The strategic foresight, which is the name of the practice that I'm professionally trained in, started after World War II. And the person who sort of coined the term, Herman Kahn, said, we must dare to think the unthinkable. And so there's a large history of strategic foresight, which is we are going to try to analyze everything. And this is our job, to bring information in and try this and try that, and help to see if we can sort of make predictions or forecasts. And over the course of time, the practice has shifted, in some cases faster than others, about how to see the future, as in it's linear. So if change is happening at this rate, it's going to continue to happen at this rate. To stories that are more, we create the future, and everyone has a right to the future. However, it is a privilege and a luxury to think about it. Mm-hmm. So when we do, and this is very important in my practice, when we do, to think about people who are not able to think about the future, be represented as best we can in that workshop setting. So this is why adding the opportunity for interviews or community workshops or doing research that is very much outside of our own lens within the organization or within the project is really, really important. And we're seeing more and more of those practices emerge in other places around the world, where collective vision is more important, more valued, or even predominant over the individual life experience. So I'm not sure if that sort of answers your question.
Yeah. Well, I have lots of follow-ups either way. So one thing that struck me as interesting is that your company, Futurist Present, first of all, there's a plural in there. We have to explore that. But also, it's in common with the title of your thesis. So I want to get into that thesis a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about your thesis from OCAD? What was the process you developed to help individuals envision the future?
No, thanks for asking. That thesis was something that I did between 2014 and 2017. The program is a Master's of Design in Strategic Foresight and Innovation. And so it's got a lot of different practices that come together, including design thinking, which is putting the human at the center of the problem, and then finding out how they think about a problem or pain that they need to kind of resolve, or a gain that they want to get for themselves. There's innovation, which is very much a process of test and iterate, and in my view, also the soft side of management. So the mindset of like, we aren't going to get it right the first time, and it's okay if we didn't. That's actually very helpful. If we think that there's a second time, it kind of frees us up. And then strategic foresight, which is this systems thinking, in a lot of the practices, thinking about the future in multiple scenarios, and how they come together under this sort of umbrella of design, which is a process of exploration and then converging on some answers to some questions and holding those a little bit loosely too. So what I did in my research at OCAD was I interviewed about 12 people or more, and had an evolution of asking them questions. What do you think about the future? And in some cases, I asked them, what do you think about the future of this, or this? So tell me about the environment. Tell me about what you think technology is going to be. Tell me what you think the economy is going to be. And that was a challenge for some people because they didn't connect to that subject area. And I was putting them into a position of being subject matter experts. In other cases, I would ask them to list some things that they wanted to accomplish. And, not necessarily bucket list things, but things like, I want to be healthy for my trip next year. I want to do a PhD program and things like that. So, no boundaries on the scale or what it is that they're interested in. Just write those down on some Post-it notes. Okay, now let's order them in a way that you can sort of accomplish them. And that's a bit of coaching methods, but all of these things ended up building up a large database of how, in my research, of how people think about the future with themselves in it, and how they can actually start to get practical about it. So sort of what I mentioned earlier is I ask people to think about multiple different futures that have strong characteristics, and how might they play a role in each of those, which is quite the opposite of what you want to do when you grow up, which puts the
I'm still working on it.
Well, then we should go through the Making Futures Present.
I agree. Yes.
Together. And after each person, after a person goes through each of these different futures that they have created about what they assume, what they think is not likely to happen, what they wish would happen, and what they fear would happen, then we start to look at the commonalities between their statements. And there are commonalities in how they want to contribute.
Do you mean, sorry to interrupt, but do you mean between individuals, or between what individuals said under given possible scenarios of the future?
Yes. Well, both, actually. The commonalities about what someone would say about being in each future tend to belay their underlying aspirations or fears, or things that can, I guess, be foundational platforms for how they are in the world today.
Right.
And then I'll ask them to make some sort of make a prop, make a tool to solve a problem that you see. And in one example, someone made like a magic wand. So it wasn't it's not a talisman. People are making things that are, they make things that are concrete, and you can manipulate them as tools. So he made like a magic wand that would help him to navigate through a city where he could walk in safe spaces and be alerted if there was some danger in other spaces, so that he could navigate safely through an urban environment. And turns out he was an architect. And so he had strong feelings about urban design and about how people respond to urban design. Mm-hmm. And what he knew was sort of this like innate, I guess, sort of this spiritual and the ethereal part of how people act in certain spaces. And so this was simply physicalizing it, turning into a tool, and then became something that he could talk about when he went forward into his other work and job and like projects and stuff like that. So now he was able to articulate that he knew that some spaces had emotional impacts on people that were positive and were negative. So it brought out this internal knowledge in a way that if he had just been asked, what do you want to keep doing? What are you good at? That might not have come off the top of his head.
So I'm getting way out of my lane here, but I should know this because I used to work in the fine arts faculty. The idea of the same theme emerging over and over in multiple sort of visions of the future, is that akin to a leitmotif, or am I even saying that word correctly? Leitmotif, like a theme that comes out over and over that echoes, and so you sort of realize that it's important when it recurs.
Yeah. I don't know the term leitmotif, but definitely there is a what we look for by and large in all of the futurist work is themes that are recurring, and we're also looking for the points that are actually quite surprising. And we call those signals, and they're actually things that kind of catch our eye and say, well, that's interesting, that's strange, I never would have expected that. So we hold the place for both as at a research and data level, we hold a place for both as equal value.
Right.
And then when we, start to get in with our tools and figure out, which thing might have a stronger impact.
So when you work with people, well, I guess the first question is, do you follow a similar practice now in your company, or have you streamlined it, or did you find that was right in the first place?
Thanks for asking that in that way. I think personally, I'll always be a student. And so the desire to make it like repeatable for everyone, everywhere, all the time is something that I could never do. Like it sort of, makes my skin itch to think about that. And so even when I was doing the workshops with over 100 people, it would change every time. Sometimes depending on, whether it was youth in an underserved neighborhood in Toronto or people who were sort of at the end of their career. The dynamics would always change. What they were comfortable talking about would always change. So I use that insight and that knowledge and care for people as a listener and bring that into the larger organizations that I work with that are looking at problems that are related to an organization and the people in it who bring their skills, their passions, their whole life to the roles that they're there. But oftentimes they may not like their job. Something like 85% of people don't like their job.
Mm-hmm.
So I honor that and help people to make this a valuable experience as for their individual participation as well as for their organization. So I honor that some people have different comfort levels in thinking about the future, whether they are often invited to think about their thoughts of the future or not, whether their ability to imagine the future is even possible when, depending on their own life circumstances. Sometimes it's just too far, it's too hard and biologically inaccessible. So to kind of answer your question about is it repeatable, with every organization, their question is different. My response as a practitioner is different. The tools that I use, the program that I design in order to help them to think about the future so that they can make better decisions today is different. And I do it with care. I do it with respect and honor people who are in the room and people who are not in the room. And that's the same. However, I've learned that my style as a practitioner is to be very attentive to the moment.
Have you, just out of curiosity, have you ever tried this over Zoom? Like during COVID, I imagine it was hard to get people in a room together. Did you manage to create these experiences online?
I did, yeah. It's interestingly, right at the beginning of COVID, researchers from the University of Toronto had asked us to help them to envision how youth could stop vaping.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a crisis that's hot and happening. And so we designed a weekend where we would help the youth to talk about what it is that helps them make changes in their behavior. And we had to cancel that weekend. And 1 month later, we turned it around and we did the entire thing online. And what the fortunate thing about doing it online, even though it was isolating and difficult for everybody to physically connect with us as researchers and connect with other people who are also struggling with the same addiction, was that they were sharing their lived experience while they were trapped in their basement or their bedroom or something like that. And we were able to ask questions using online platforms in a way that they were able to share personal stories that they would not have been able to had we had the original design in place.
Okay, that's really interesting. I share the experience that there are definitely pros as well as cons to being online. Sometimes it's just a matter of it's so much easier for the host to make sure everybody gets a turn. It's really easy to hide in person in a way that's surprising, right? Because it's just there's so many people between you and the presenter that you can sort of just stay out of it. But it's very egalitarian. We all have the same size square.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You remind me when you talk about the vaping experience. You remind me of experiments that were done. I'm pretty sure it was at UCLA, which is they showed participants in a research study digitally aged photos of themselves in a way that made them relate to their future self. And as a consequence, they were more inclined, for example, to forego $1 now in favor of $2 later. You know, the whole one marshmallow now, two marshmallows later study that they did. You know, these kids are going to do better in the future because they were able to resist one cookie in favor of two in the future. But seeing a digitally aged photo of yourself was helping with that. I wonder if you get that same sort of reaction when you invite people to think about their futures, that they tend to be kinder to their future selves.
I think so. I know it has certainly made me a much more optimistic and easy to heal person when something happens. And the techniques are different for everybody. So in the work that I do, I'll ask so again, along this vaping project, I created an online platform where youth would go through an experience about thinking what helps them to make a good decision. Mm-hmm. And then they would write a note to themselves. I'm so happy and grateful. I made this decision and here's why. And because of it, I'm now able to X, Y, Z. And that kind of thinking really depends on how you ask the question and how you set it up. Part of that is humans have a tendency to look for negative things. It's how we got off the savannah. And so we have our radar up for change. Right. We have our radar up for things that could threaten us. We're now bombarded by that. And if we ask a question without, or show a prompt without considering the way that it's asked, then the answers could be more negative. They could be more detrimental, more doom and gloom. And I'll give you an example. Not one from my work, but there was a group of teenagers that were asked, what do you think the future is going to be like, or something like that? And they just, a lot of the research right now says that teenagers are very, think it's going to be very desolate, and AI is, going to take over any jobs that they could have, and so on, and the climate, and terrible, terrible things. However, if you ask them, in this study, they asked the teenagers a different question, something probably more akin to, what do you want the future to be like? Or what is the best future you could possibly imagine? And they went from appearing to be pessimistic to saying optimistic statements. So if we think of cigarette packages with, people who are dying of cancer or something like that on the package, it may be a provocation. For some people works, as in, I don't want to be part of that. In other cases, it may be seem unrealistic and impossible. That, that's a very rare case. Mm-hmm. That could never happen to me. So there's a lot of intention and design that whoever is creating an image for someone to react to, they have to put a lot of consideration into what part of that person do they want to respond.
Right. In all the work that you've done, what surprises people the most when they think about their future? Do you see any themes in there?
One thing that surprised me was that very few people thought of themselves other than being the center of their story. and I'll expand on that a little bit. When I would ask about where they would be in the future, very few people said myself and my partner. They would say, I am doing this.
Interesting. Well, divorce rate is pretty bad.
Yes, there's that. But it was people who were, like single, but married, but like had children, whatever, that their vision of themselves in the future, and this could be just the North American phenomenon of where I was getting, all of the participants from, that they did not see themselves as being part of a collective in the future.
Interesting. Not seeing the big table at Thanksgiving.
They would see the big table at Thanksgiving, but they wouldn't. It was the reinforcing of the sort of, how do I contextualize this more? So people weren't talking about the afterlife or next life or anything at that point. They also weren't talking about where they see themselves like making grand decisions. Like, we will be XYZ. So they weren't talking about themselves in the family unit.
Well, that might be a whole new line of business, because if you can get couples to agree on what the next 20 years hold, that would be fantastic.
I think I want bigger problems than that.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because you've sort of touched on this, but I'm sure you know what that is, but just in case somebody listening doesn't know, the idea is that there's a bunch of basics we need to take care of, like food and shelter and water and security. But then you go up this pyramid to things like love and belonging and purpose. When people examine their future, and you're sort of touching on this, but I want to get more detail on this, do people tend to look at the bottom, or do they tend to look at the top? And do you try to nudge them to look towards the top of the pyramid?
I have a little bone to pick with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, actually.
Okay.
There's a Brazilian economist named Manfred Max Neef, and I read a blog post comparing Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Manfred Max Neef's fundamental human needs. And Maslow's is, what she says in the post is that Maslow's is by design. When the soldiers came back from World War II, let's make sure they get fed. Let's make sure they get houses, all those basic things. And then once they've done that, then we can make sure that they can integrate into society. Then we can help them get education. And then we can help them be contributors at the highest level, and consumers and all those things. And at that point, they will be the most beneficial to society, because they've now they've got wisdom. I think that a fundamental problem with that is that assuming you can't have love, you can't be wise, you can't learn unless you have money and all of the other things below it, when in fact this hierarchy, I think, is very much based on institutional provision. Manfred Max Neef's fundamental human needs is actually a circle, and there's 9 fundamental human needs in that. And he talks about how each need, such as love, freedom, creativity, food, shelter, security, that each of those is something that as a human we make a target of trying to achieve. and that it's very dynamic, and throughout your day, throughout your career, throughout your life, you aim towards different ones at different times, and you can never have all 9 at the same time. But you can aim towards, a couple, and that's very much driven by context and individuals' choices, in individuals' values, and then that is a completely different way of organizing society and I guess how to create a sustainable future, in my belief. So I like to use that as a I guess something that informs the way I work.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't often bring that visibly into the work that I do.
So, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy needs, this is a framework or a model, and all frameworks, and the map is never the territory. I completely agree. And I do take the point that sometimes you can find love even if you don't have security. Mm-hmm. Often that's the most interesting story you'll ever hear, right? So I agree that one can have one without the other, and so maybe the hierarchy is not the thing we should focus on. But I would argue that concentric circles have their own hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So really what I'm asking is, there is a spectrum, whether it's a hierarchy or not, from things that if I don't have in the near term, I'll die, mm-hmm. things that I don't have in the medium term, I'll die, or things that if I don't have in the very long term, I'll have a meaningless life. Mm-hmm. And so when people examine their life and their future, where do they tend to look? Where do they focus on? Survival needs or things that would make them emotionally thrive?
That's tremendously contextual, and is getting outside of my domain of expertise. However, if we apply that to organizations, they are very much in the here and now. Politics, very much in the here and now. And it's very, very, very challenging to help them to step out of the next 6 months or the next year for a moment to think about what they want in the future, even, and then how that's going to inform what they do today. And it's a knee-jerk reaction to respond to something instantly. Because it feels good. It feels good to make sure that you get that rent check paid. It is a challenge to think about, is this the neighborhood I should live in if it's in a low floodplain? Should I turn up the thermostat in, even though it's going to melt the glaciers around the polar bears? It's our natural inclination to think about things that are closer at hand, both in time and geographic and scope of the problem and everything.
Right. So the process that I'm familiar with, because I looked at your paper, is very personal, right? It's about an individual. How do you scale it up when you are working with an organization? How do you get multiple participants to form a shared vision of the future or futures and what they can do about it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for asking that question. It's what I used in my experience of making futures present is essentially the understanding of what it's like to do strategic foresight within an organization. However, it's crafted for one person so that they understand that thinking about the future as futures, plural, thinking about the future as something that you don't own or control, then thinking about the future as what do you prefer it to be, and what is a way that you would like to get there. And then again, at the sort of end of the workshop that I designed, or the technique that I designed, they have made a prop using their hands. They have written to themselves from the future. They have told the story of themselves in the future. So they go through multiple ways of processing what they are doing in the future. With an organization, it's a similar approach in that it's multiple different ways of helping them to consider what the future might be like. And it's everything from small group exercises to individual creation of newspapers of the future, or news articles of the future, to asking questions about, if this is what we're doing now, how will that look if the world changes? There's dozens of different models. I'll give an example of something that I just did in Medellin, Colombia. To help an organization first think about the future. What is the muscle that we're trying to build? This was with Parque Explora, who's a science museum in Medellin. And I asked them to think about the last 50 years and what has happened since 1973, what happened 25 years ago, and what's happening today. And what are some of the dominant stories 50 years ago, and who was in control, and what was the power dynamics and everything. And then what of that story remains today, even though it's a silent or very minimal impact on what life is like in Medellin today. And then ask that question in reverse. So what's something that wasn't really important back in 1973 and has become a major way that people or the city perceive the future or perceive the present day? And I asked the same question in one more way. And that's not typically how you use this particular tool called Three Horizons. What it is typically used for is, what do 50 years from now look like? And what's the dominant story then? And what is the story of today that will have faded away significantly? And that requires a lot of, I guess, research input. Some of it is what people in the room bring to the table. Others is research that is we supply so that they have a bigger picture. So this is the size of the population now. What's being estimated in 50 years is roughly this. This is the average age of the population now. In 50 years, it's estimated that. So we will help to bring those types of data points together and ask them to reflect, detect, analyze particular issues or topics, and then to comment whether or not they think it is a major threat to their what it is that they want to do.
So I love that exercise, because 50 years is kind of a human time scale. Probably if you asked me when I was 20, I'd say that was like ancient history. But, as we get towards the middle of our life, 50 years makes sense. And you can sort of, it's a reminder how much things can change in 50 years when you look back. And so it softens up the future in a way, right? I love that. The idea you had about writing a news article reminds me of something that Amazon does apparently, which is if you want to invent a new product, you have to come to the meeting with a press release, so that you can get a sense of how the world will engage with it. What's exciting about it? Don't tell me how it works. Don't tell me how we're going to make it. Sell me the sizzle.
Amazing.
So we're talking about reasons to look into the future, but there are some people who say maybe we shouldn't look into the future, or at least not look into the future all the time. Eckhart Tolle wrote a book called The Power of Now. I don't know if you've read this book, but it emphasizes present moment awareness and setting aside thoughts of oneself. Let the universe unfold, with your place inside it as you calmly occupy your particular perch in the moment. Is it sort of like sleep and exercise? They're both valuable, but you can't do them at the same time. Like there should be times when you're thinking about the future and other times when you just enjoy the present.
I have difficulties with sort of like binary questions, like is it this or that? And with futures thinking, which is it's a few different pieces to that. So there's sort of mindset, there's a rigorous practice to it, there is doing it for the sake of making decisions for today. In other cases, it's for thinking about the future to help to declare what your bias is and what you anticipate the future will be like if things don't change. So there's lots of uses, if you will, of thinking about the future. There's also lots of uses about thinking about the present and thinking about the past as well. One of the things that I've found in my research is that, or my practice, is that people have a tendency to think more about one or the other, and that's how they do their problem solving. So, for example, if you are thinking about the future, and you may have strong visionary skills, creative skills, skills for the thinking abstractly, and so on. If you help to solve problems or try to solve problems by thinking in the present, that may be very much project management skills and so on, and very sort of pragmatic and like, and then if you tend to think about the past, there's other, and I can refer people to, I believe it's called Mind Time, and it's a free survey, and it's like 18 questions, and it helps you to locate where you have a tendency for problem solving. And the way it might show up for somebody who tends to think about the past more is, well, we put all our eggs in one basket. We just got to keep with that basket. And that has tremendous application. And as a counterbalance to someone who is, let's just keep looking forward. Let's just, forget what happened in the past. And then someone who's working in the present or thinking about problems in the present, also having them in that conversation can help people to focus. Like, it's fine. We put all our eggs in one basket. We hear you. We still need to do something with those eggs. And balancing out the person that's saying, well, let's not do eggs anymore. Like, let's do something else. So this is an interesting little part of the bigger picture about creating the future using many different people in the conversation, is to help balance out. So what are we going to do right now?
Right. One way of defining power is the ability to shape the future. And, I can do that with how I use my money or how I use my time or how I use my vote. Is there a risk that someone will look at their future and discover they don't have the resources to change it the way they want?
Yeah. Yeah. Is there a risk? That's an interesting question. I've never thought about that before. I've certainly am sensitive to asking about someone to think about their future. When they can't, when it's too difficult, when the present moment is too overwhelming, asking them to think about the future might help underscore that feeling of lack or hopelessness or whatever. So it's the yes, for sure. There's a risk. I'm not sure if that's the word that I would connect with asking someone to think about the future.
Or challenge, perhaps.
Challenge is a good word. Yeah. And not having a feeling of agency and then being challenged to think about the future is can be quite alienating, and actually I think we see this in the way societies are behaving in a lot of countries right now, is that the fear of change is overwhelming their ability to see the present as something that could be better. And so societies, in a lot of voters, in a lot of places, are throwing out the anchor and saying, I don't want to go into the future because I'm afraid of change. I don't understand it. And I really would rather have the devil that I know. Thank you very much.
So moving on to sunnier topics, I saw a post that you are writing a book. What's the book about?
The book is called Making Futures Present.
Good name.
And it's for future thinking maverick decision makers who are trying to make a decision in extreme uncertainty. And the book is a collection of a series of interviews with people who are maverick decision makers, and they're talking about how they make decisions in times of uncertainty. And I'm finding that in some of the cases, people make decisions based on experience of thinking about uncertainty and role playing it and running it through tests in a lab. So doing strategic foresight as a practice or futures thinking mindset as a way of being in the world. In other cases, I'm finding that the people that I'm interviewing are stopped dead in their tracks because they've become so practiced at solving problems that they know, and haven't dedicated resources to figuring out how to think differently. And there's lots of examples of companies that weren't ready for massive change. And I spoke to companies and organizations and individuals across the board. And the ones that were most prepared for the disruption of the pandemic, as an example, were led by people, mavericks, who felt that uncertainty was omnipresent and that this was just another thing that piled on top of how they are already nimble, how they are already expecting the unexpected to be business as usual.
And Can you expand on your definition of mavericks and talk a little bit about whether that's something that's always useful or useful under certain circumstances? And should we all be cultivating maverick tendencies?
It's a question, conversation that I'm having with another woman named Billy, and Billy wrote the book on mavericks. She interviewed 100 mavericks, and she and I will go head to head, and are ready and willing to do so in a public forum. She will stand and say a maverick is born. She'll stand on that one. I will stand on a maverick is a hat that you can put on. So therefore, a maverick, not that a maverick can be made, but that it's a skill that you can pull out when needed, and that you can, that a leader can help to be provocative, help to be, help to bring in new ideas, fresh ideas, challenge the status quo, I guess, thirst for innovation. In order for them to be effective, it's something that they might have to tune down to give the floor to others, or to serve up an idea in a way that is a little bit more contextually relevant, so that other people can buy into it.
Well, I think I'm Team Maggie on this one, because I like the expression "we contain multitudes." That we should be able to put this hat on, and that, today I'm exploring, today I'm exploiting, that we are able to be context sensitive. So I like that thesis, whether it's true or not. It's aspirational. I heard you say that you've made it a mission to help 8 million people understand the future is not set in stone. So my question is, why only 8?
Well, I come from a background in marketing, and so the measure of success has to be a certain threshold.
Very audacious goals.
Yeah. So only 8 is the 8 confirmed, and I guess acting on the theory or a predilection that the future is not set in stone. In order to do that, my target audience has to be 100 million people, as an example. No, I haven't put any empirical research behind this, but I chose it because it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the number of people on Earth today. So,
okay, because it's a fraction of what, 8 billion? Is that the idea? So 1 in 1,000 are in your catchment area.
Yes.
I love it. So, well, we better get on it then. How can people learn more about you and your work and your services?
I think one of the things that they can do is reach out they can go to my website, which is futurispresent.com. And, but I really enjoy speaking with people on LinkedIn as well. I find that the most interesting people can start a conversation there that gets to a level of depth and interest and sharing that a website is a one-way conversation.
Right.
So I prefer LinkedIn.
Yeah, so do I. I mean, it's not just social, it's sapiosocial, right? I mean, people are actually trying to think about what they say as opposed to knee-jerk, "You're stupid." I do prefer that. My last question, this has been terrific. Thank you so much, Maggie. My last question is, when you examine your own future, what are the factors you consider?
Well, I'm reading a book called Younger Next Year for women. It's the 10th time I've read it in the last 15 years. And one of the things that I think about a lot is how I'm going to be as an aged person. And so what are decisions that I need to make today about living well, into my 90s? Because the reality is people get older and it's a sort of a choice on whether you choose to decay or not. So I'm trying to be very conscious of that. I'm also something that certainly concerns me is the climate crisis and how we, I guess, just as an example, how many days would Toronto survive if if the grid went down? Mm-hmm. And so thinking about a way that I can live simply so that others can simply live is a practice that I try to cultivate every day. And with that means not making locking up decisions that can be can't be reversed. Mm-hmm. So that when I'm older, my choices still suit me.
I love it. My guest today was Maggie Greyson. Thank you, Maggie, for being on the show.
Thanks, Tim. I loved your questions, and this has been a fantastic journey. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much as well.
Thanks for listening to the Humanity in the Loop podcast. The opinions expressed by the host and guests of this podcast are their own and do not reflect those of their employer or any other affiliation. Humanity is not automatic.